In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And God said, "Let there be light." And God separated the light from the darkness. And he saw that the light was good. Then he separated the waters of the earth, creating the skies and seas. The earth brought forth vegetation, and God saw that it was good. And God made two great lights. Then he made the animals. Then he created you.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from darkness. And so begins the creation account as recorded in Genesis 1 that so many of us are so familiar with. Now let me compare that with another story. In the beginning there was nothing. And from that nothing, a singularity formed, a small spot in that nothingness. And suddenly that singularity exploded with great force, an explosion that created all the matter that we now know that is in the universe. And it was an explosion that brought not only matter into existence, but brought tremendous order into that matter. So that it then organized itself into stars and into galaxies and then into planets and then into life itself, into us. Now that's another story, two stories, each telling a very, very different account of the creation of space and of time and of everything that exists. Now, one is true and one is total fabrication. They both can't be true. They're totally different stories, but the question is, which one is true? That's what we're looking at here, is we're looking at this whole idea that you have a story of creation, you have a story of evolution, and then how does faith fit in? You know, some people will argue that, well, one is a story of science and the other a story of religion, and so therefore they can't be compared. But again, we've seen over previous weeks through the study that that's a false dichotomy. That's not the case. Both the story of creation and the story of evolution tell a story that claim to speak about science, about ultimate reality. They claim to explain what is and why it is, and how it works, what is real in our world. They both seek to tell a story about history, about what happened in the past of our universe. They both seek to tell a story about religion, because both creation and evolution make religious claims about ultimate reality, about where we came from, about why we are here, about our purpose in life, and about where we're going. Now, ultimately, neither side can, without question, prove the truthfulness of their claims. The fact of the matter is we can't go back in time and relive the creation of the universe. We can't do that. We can't put it in a test tube and see what actually happened. I cannot prove with total certainty God's existence. I can't show him. I can't manipulate him. I can't test him. But neither can an evolutionist or materialist prove that God does not exist. You see, ultimately, as we've seen in previous weeks, both the creationist and the evolutionist must accept their views by faith. But we've also seen that the faith that God calls us to, that we should have, should not be a blind faith that ignores science and reason, or that rejects the evidence of science and history that we're able to know. Now, some people believe that the Bible calls us to that blind faith. Some people believe that, God calls us, I just close my eyes, I know that Bible says it, and that's all that matters. And I don't want to know anything about science. I don't want to know anything about these other areas. But again, we've seen in the past weeks, again, if you're visiting us for the first time, I'm making very quick statements on things that we've spent a lot of time developing in the first 3 weeks of this series. We've seen in the past weeks that God does not call us to a blind faith. He does not call us to take a leap into the dark that goes against our logic and reason and evidence that we have, but he calls us to an intelligent faith, a faith that's, in a sense, a step toward the light. It's not a leap into the dark, it's a step into the light. One that is consistent with logic and reason. And we've seen in previous weeks, we'll see some more today, that numerous times the Bible calls us to look to creation. Why? Because that's God's handiwork. And the Bible teaches us that God reveals himself, not fully, but God reveals himself in part in creation. So if we study creation, meaning if we study science, then we should be able to learn something about God. If it's true, then everything that we learn should affirm the ideas that are taught in the Bible. But while the Bible does call us to faith that is consistent with the evidence of science and history, we see that ultimately we still need to have faith. And ultimately is faith. Why? Because while it's a faith that is consistent with logic and reason and the evidence, it also is a faith that ultimately goes beyond it. It's something that is beyond what we can see, beyond what we can manipulate, even though it's consistent. Several weeks ago, we used an illustration that I think is such a powerful picture of that. It's from the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade movie. And if you remember that scene, he comes to this big gap, and he's supposed to take the leap of faith, and everything tells him there's nothing there. But it says a leap of faith that you should close your eyes and step into nothingness and hope that there's something that will carry you. And that's what people believe that faith is. And that's not biblical faith. Biblical faith is what happened when he went to the other side. When he crossed that ravine, he picked up a bunch of dirt and he threw it out, and the dirt came and rested on this invisible beam. See, that's what faith is it takes up what we can know, the evidence that we can know, and we throw it out there. And ultimately, I still cannot see God, but I can see the outline of truth. See, I can see what's consistent with what I know. See, it ultimately still calls us to put our faith in what we cannot see, but it's what's consistent. And see, what we're now looking at throughout this series is, do the facts of science support the claims of creation and evolution? What we're doing is we're taking the dirt and we're throwing it out there, and we're saying, here's one story about how the world began that the evolutionists tell, and we're throwing the dirt out, and is it consistent with that? And we're looking at the creation story, and we're throwing the dirt out, and we're saying, is it consistent? What are we seeing? Now, I will tell you, like last week, we're going to look at a lot of science this morning. And we're going to be looking at a lot of things, and even last week, people said last week, boy, I can't remember all that. I can't. And with many of these things, it's not that we're going to totally comprehend them. You're going to pass the test. The goal is just to be overwhelmed by the evidence of science, so that you see that the science is so strong, making a statement saying that God is the designer. Now, I joked last week about how, as we're going to look at this, that you might start thinking of me of Pastor Mike, the science guy. Well, we were talking amongst the staff, and we said, well, if I'm going to be Pastor Mike, the science guy, well, then I need my own introduction to the message. So we have it.
Shed Light with Pastor Mike. Mike. Shed Light with Pastor Mike.
Light rules.
Shed Light with Pastor Mike.
DNA is a property of design.
Mike.
T minus 10 seconds.
Mike. Shed Light with Pastor Mike.
Now, I've got to say, Danny Mitchell, that was like one of those ideas that, wouldn't it be neat if we do this? And Danny's like, I can do it. He said, I've got to give him all the credit. And, it's fun to be able to do that. But that's what we're doing, is we're looking at science. Last week what we did is we looked at science at the smallest scale. We looked at the cell and DNA and the origin of life. And we looked at the question and said, as we throw it out there, what does the evidence of science affirm? And it's totally inconsistent with evolution. And it's totally consistent with creation. Well, now this week we're going to look at the biggest possible scale. This week we're going to look at the universe. We're going to look at the stars. We're going to look at the planets. We're going to look at the creation of the universe, the creation of everything. And again, we're going to say, is what's more consistent? Is what we know of science consistent with the idea that God created, or is it consistent with the idea that everything happened by chance and has formed itself by the random forces of nature? So let's look at that. What we're going to look at the heavens, and we're doing so because not only we're called to do that, but the Bible calls us to do that. The Bible calls us to understand that the heavens declare the glory of God. The Bible repeatedly, we've seen, calls us to say, look at all of creation. But what's interesting is numerous times it calls us specifically to look at the heavens. And so let me give you a couple examples. Psalm 19. Psalm 19 says this: the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day it pours out speech. Night to night it reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. He was saying, you look at the heavens and it proclaims, it declares. You can't miss it. Another example, Psalm 8. The psalmist there, O Lord, O our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above in the heavens. Out of the mouths of babes and infants you have established strength because of your foes, to still the enemy and the avenger. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? And so what the Bible calls us to is to look to the heavens, because when we look to the heavens, what we're going to find is they declare God's glory. Now, let's look at the evidence. Does it declare God's glory, or does it support the whole idea of everything's by chance? The first thing we're going to look at today is the origin of the universe. And the question is, where did everything come from? Now, as we're going to think about this, I want to take a moment to think. We talk about the universe, and we know the universe is big. I don't know if you ever really thought about how big it is. Because when we talk about matter and all the things that exist, when you think about how much it is, some of us have had the experience where, it's hard to do here and, by the city, but some of us had the experience if you go to a very rural area and you're able to see a night sky when you're far away from any of the city lights, and you look up there, and if it's a clear night and there's little or no moon, and you're able to see, people estimate that you could see about 2,000 stars. And you look out there and it's incredible, it's awesome. Now, if you have a telescope, they say if you have a good telescope that you could see up to 10,000 stars. This is a picture from an earthbound telescope. And you could just see these incredible stars, and you look at this, and again, it's an incredible. But our eyes cannot see anything close to the amount of stars that are out there, so that even with the telescope, if we can see a couple thousand, they estimate that just in our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, they estimate that there are 400 billion stars. That's incredible. When you think about the space in our star and how big it is, and 400 billion. But we aren't the only galaxy. What's interesting is that, we have been, over time, expanding our ability to be able to look deep in space. And they keep trying to find the end of space. Scientists keep trying to say, well, where's the end? Where can we see the last of the galaxies? And you know what they find? Is they haven't found it yet. They keep looking, and as we have further and further ability to look deeper, what we're finding is galaxies as far as we can see. In fact, I have a couple pictures here. These are from the Hubble, it's called the Hubble Extreme Deep Field, where they took the Hubble telescope and they put it out in an area, and they just had it open there for a long time to pick up light. These are not stars, these are all galaxies. These are all other galaxies. And so when you look at this, it's been estimated that they say that we can now see around 100 billion galaxies. But how many there are, we don't know, because we know there are more beyond what we can see. We've not come to the end. And they have multiple pictures like this where you have, these are all galaxies that are out there that we see there's incredible numbers. So now people have said if you take what we know of the galaxies and if you multiply them by the size of our galaxy, if we think of that's average, they now say that the estimated number of stars, it's 1 or 10 times 10 with 24 zeros after it. So again, it's one of these numbers that I can't even say. And so it's a huge number of things. And now to give you a perspective of even the size of this, okay, let's try to to talk about the size of the universe, we've got to talk about light speed, because anything else is too big. So the speed of light, it's 186,282 miles per second, which is over 670 million miles per hour. So it's very, very fast, all right? So now just to think of this, light speed, Earth is 93 million miles from the sun. Okay, it takes about a little over 8 1/3 minutes, 8 minutes and 20 seconds for light to get from the sun to Earth. To understand the size of our solar system, it takes roughly 43 minutes, only 8 minutes to get to Earth, 43 minutes to get to Jupiter. It takes about 1 hour and 20 minutes to get to Saturn, about 5.5 hours to get to Pluto. So it's only 8 minutes to us, 5.5 hours to get to Pluto. So you see the incredible size of our solar system. Now, do you know how long it takes light to get to the nearest star? The nearest star to us is Proxima Centauri, and it takes 4.2 years. So think about just how we're 8 minutes away, 4.2 years to get to the nearest star. And then they estimate that if you looked at the Milky Way galaxy, it takes 120,000 light years to go from one end to another. Now we see all these pictures of all these galaxies. The nearest galaxy to us in our universe, the nearest one is the Andromeda galaxy, and it's 2.9 million light years away. Now you imagine, we can't even begin to talk about this. They say that what we have now seen of the solar of the galaxy or the universe, I keep mixing these up. Universe, what we now have seen is about 13.8 billion light years. Now the majesty of that, these incredible number of stars, all the planets, all this, we're just 8 minutes away from the sun. And you know what's amazing is what the Bible says about that? Look what it says in Isaiah chapter 40. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, or marked off the heavens with a span? You know what it's saying? You know how the universe is? God says, it's about this big. That's literally what it's saying, is that God marks off the heavens with his hand. Now, he's not physical, but the fact is that he is so above and beyond that to God, it's just something he measures like that. Or we go later on Isaiah 40. It says, lift up your eyes on high and see who created these, who brings out all their hosts by number, calling them by name, by the greatness of his might, and because he is strong in power, not one is missing. That he knows every star by name. He's in total control. That's an amazing picture. Now here you look at this and you say, heavens declare God's glory, but do they? Well, what about the evolutionist story? What do they say about the universe? See, they don't believe that it came from God. It wasn't created by God, so then where did it come from? Now, until the 1920s and 30s, evolutionists strongly argued something called the static universe. Because one of the things that we've seen in the past weeks is that evolutionists is very close to the idea of materialism, which is this idea that the only thing that really exists, the only thing that's eternal is material matter, the things in the universe. And so what the evolutionists would argue is that, well, the universe has always existed. It's always been there. It's always going to be there because material matter, it's eternal. And so that was what they've always argued. But there was a problem with that when the 1920s and 1930s, because what we started to find is that the universe was not static, it was not still, it was moving, it was expanding. And the more that we found out that it was expanding, what you realize that if it's expanding outward, that means that at one time it had come inward. That it was not eternal, but it actually had a center point where it all started. Now that was a crisis, because what happened is that it's one thing to say that universes, matter is eternal, and it always existed, but when you look at the idea of it expanding, at first, they argued against this. You hear the term Big Bang? It was made up by evolutionists that mocked the idea of an expanding universe because they hated the idea because they had no answer for it. So now suddenly you realize that science clearly demonstrates that the universe had a beginning. It didn't always exist. So then what do you do? Because what they run into is something that is very, very, very simple logic. They call it the law of causation. It's simply this, that everything that had a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore it has a cause. It's this idea that we don't know anything that ever comes from nothing, right? You're never there and suddenly, you're like, oh man, that just suddenly appeared. That came out of nowhere. That's amazing. Of course that never happens. Everything that we know about logic and about science tells us that nothing comes from nothing. Everything tells us that if there's something that begins, if something is there, it must have been put there. There has to be a cause. But now suddenly we have this universe, and we have people that deny God, but they have to explain where it's not just that something came from nothing, but everything came from nothing, which is pretty implausible. How do you explain everything coming from nothing? Because we deny that there is a God, and now we have to admit that everything that exists didn't always exist, because science has proven it. And so to make matters worse, it's not that everything came from nothing, but now we believe that it had to explode from nothing. And so now they've come up with this idea of the Big Bang, which they mocked. Now they say, well, now that was our idea. So there was this singularity. So there was once nothing, but then somehow this little spot in space formed, and everything was in there, and then it exploded. And out of this explosion, everything that was that exists was created. Now again, think of the size and majesty of the universe. All that came from nothing. Now, they make fun of us for believing that God created all things, but they think that it's really logical that nothing created all things. Now, you see the problem with that. So here's what we're to believe, that there was nothing, and then this nothing exploded. And the explosion that exploded from nothing created everything. And that everything that was created from the explosion somehow organized itself into a universe that allowed for the creation of life. And not only that, but now we've evolved to become smart enough to discover and understand the very laws that disprove that whole theory. Now that's what they teach. Now what does the Bible teach? In the beginning, God created. Now let me just ask you, just logically, if there is a possibility that there is a God exists, because again, that's the problem, is a lot of people, it's not science, it's scientism. They deny the possibility of God. But if there is a possibility that God exists, what makes more sense? That God created everything, or that nothing created everything? Let's throw the dirt out there. Now let's go a little further. I'll even give you a moment the possibility that nothing can create everything. Okay, but that doesn't solve the problem, because there's still a huge problem, because what created everything? Well, the Big Bang, this big explosion. Now, in your experience, do explosions generally create things or destroy things? Yeah, but this explosion created everything. And in your experience, does explosions generally destroy order, or do they create order? Destroys order. But now we've got to believe that there's an explosion that not only created everything, but created incredible order. Because what we're finding now in the last 30 or so years is that the universe has order beyond what anybody could ever begin to imagine. They call it the fine-tuning of the universe. There is order there that it just, again, now this gets into heavy physics. It gets into science that I can barely understand and let alone try to explain it. But there is incredible order. And because it's much more in science, as we did last week, I'm going to try to get some help of different scientists who have taken these ideas and simplified them and put them into a little video that helps explain it. So watch this and you'll see the idea that we're explaining.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would, again, be life-prohibiting. Or another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely.
Now you look at this and you say, that's only used 3 examples. And physicists say there was at least 20. Some people will estimate between 20 and 30. And each one is that impossible. And when you look at this and here you say, if you add them all together, the probability of this happening by chance is so far beyond, we can't even list the numbers because it's so totally impossible. And so then how does the evolutionist try to explain this? They have a couple ways. One, again, you've got to understand that the people that try to explain it, many of them start out with the assumption that there cannot be any God. And so they say, well, since there can't be any God, they call it something called the anthropic principle. And so what they say is basically, well, since we're here, it proves that we got really, 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 really lucky. Now, the evidence says that it couldn't have happened by accident. But again, the only way that makes sense is that if you remove the possibility of there being a designer. The other idea now that's becoming more and more popular is something that they call the multiverse theory, which basically is saying that somehow there is a creation of all the possible universes that could exist. Because if you create all the possible universes that could exist, you have trillions and trillions and trillions, beyond measure. And since you have all the ones that could exist, the one that actually works must exist. Now, that's the whole theory. Now, in that, what's the evidence for that? Absolutely none. Again, they're saying, well, you can't believe in God because we can't prove that, but we can believe in, unending universes. No evidence. And not only that, but it actually doesn't even solve the problem. Because you started back and you said, what was the problem we dealt with before, where the Big Bang? Where did everything come from? Well, now you've got to figure out where not only everything that we see came from, but where did the, whatever machine that's making all these universes, where did all that come from? Now you're dealing with multiple Big Bangs, most of which don't work. And where did it all come from? It doesn't solve it. It actually creates more problems. See, what's the problem? Is if you look at this, what is it trying to teach us? What is the conclusion that we should draw? Let me go back in the video and it wraps that up. What are the conclusions that we should draw if we are reasonable people and look at the evidence?
The best explanation for why the universe is fine-tuned for life may very well be it was designed that way. A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a superintellect monkeyed with physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge.
What is it more consistent with? Let me go back to a quote that was on there just a moment ago. It's by a guy named Fred Hoyle. He was the guy who coined the term Big Bang. And here you have a guy that is, strongly committed to materialism and evolution. And he said that he was totally shaken by these things. And again, here's the quote that he had. They had there. He said, "A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics, as well as with chemistry and biology. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to be so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question." It's overwhelming. What's he saying? The evidence. Here you've got a guy that says, I'm totally committed to materialism, but if I look at the evidence and I'm honest, it's totally obvious that there's design. And one of the things that we talked about last week, God didn't need to make it so complicated. Why did he make it so complex? Because he wants us to be able to look deep into science and to say the more that you look there, the more it declares my glory, the more it declares that this could not have happened by accident. It's only happened because it was created by a designer. And science you couldn't be stronger in proving that point. See, it's not even only that, because then you can go and you can say, well, now we look at the whole question of the universe, but then let's take it to our own planet. Well, let's look at the planet Earth, and the question is, when we then look at the planet Earth, does that show design? Are we unique or special, or are we just an average planet? A lot of people, what they said is that when you look at the size of the size of the universe, when you had a universe that has 10 times 10 to the 24th stars, incredible number of stars, beyond what we can imagine. And so you look at the size of this universe, and what people started to say is, well, because it's out there, there has to be all these other planets that have life. And that's last week we looked at the whole idea of the panspermia, because people are saying maybe life was easier to form somewhere else. And so much so that they started SETI, and where they have, you're looking for extraterrestrial life somewhere because we're listening to these radio signals because we just assumed that life had to start. Bill Nye, the other science guy, said this about our planet. He said, the Earth in the cosmic scheme of things is another speck, and the sun an unremarkable star. Nothing is special about the sun. The sun is another speck, and the galaxy is a speck. I'm a speck on a speck, orbiting a speck amongst other specks, still amongst other specks in the middle of specklessness. And here's what he's saying, that we're just a nothing planet, nothing special about us, that it's all the chance, and there's nothing special about humanity. There's nothing special about our design. The idea that there's a God that cares for us, why would you ever think of that? We're just a speck on a speck in the middle of specklessness. But what starts to happen is then you start to find science. It used to be that they thought there were only two things that you needed to have life. So, of course, there's multiple worlds that can have life. Well, then science grew, and we found that, no, there's not 2, there's 10. Well, there's 20. No, there's many more. And actually, the chance of these things happening together, and again, incredibly remote. Now, again, before I try to get lost in trying to explain all this, let's go back to someone who does it in a simpler way than I could ever try, and see if you can get the idea that is communicated.
If a recipe for a planet capable of supporting complex life really did exist, then what ingredients, beyond liquid water, might be required? The list of necessary factors continues to grow.
We live on this paper-thin crust. If the Earth's crust were significantly thicker, then plate tectonic recycling could not take place.
The Earth's crust varies in thickness from about 4 to 30 miles. It consists of more than a dozen tectonic plates that are in constant motion. This dynamic geology regulates the planet's interior temperature, recycles carbon, mixes chemical elements essential to living organisms, and shapes the continents. Deep within the Earth's interior, the movement of liquid iron generates a protective magnetic field essential to complex life. If our planet was smaller, its magnetic field would be weaker, allowing the solar wind to strip away our atmosphere, slowly transforming the Earth into a dead, barren world much like Mars.
We need an oxygen atmosphere, and the oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere that the Earth has is necessary for complex life.
As seen from space, the Earth's atmosphere glows as a thin blue ribbon of light. Measuring less than 1% of the planet's diameter, it is composed of a mixture of nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. As a result, our atmosphere ensures a temperate climate, protection from the sun's radiation, and the correct combination of gases necessary for liquid water and complex life.
For a size of planet like Earth, our moon is big. The current thinking is that if our moon didn't exist, neither would we.
1/4 the size of the Earth, the moon's powerful gravitational pull stabilizes the angle of its axis at a nearly constant 23.5 degrees. This ensures relatively temperate seasonal changes, and the only climate in the solar system mild enough to sustain complex living organisms.
If we find life out there, especially complex or even intelligent life, it will be around a star similar to our own.
We orbit what is known as a spectral type G2 dwarf main sequence star. It is well suited for our needs. If the Sun were less massive, like 90% of the stars in the galaxy, the habitable zone would be smaller. To remain within its boundaries, the Earth would have to be positioned closer to its star. Here, increased gravity would lock our planet's rotation into synchronization with its orbit. While one side of the Earth continually faced the Sun and increased radiation from solar flares, the dark side of the planet would lay shrouded in perpetual cold and ice. It is unlikely complex life could tolerate these drastic extremes in temperature.
A lot of things went right on Earth to have yielded complex life, absolutely.
Again, if you could look at those are just a few of the things. You really spent time at 3. I mean, if we looked at all of them, I mean, we need season 2 of Pastor Mike the Science Guy. And but what you see is the likelihood of any of those things happening by accident is remote. But when you multiply them and you realize that there are multiple things, I mean, look at some of the, let me just wrap up and see the conclusion that they draw when you consider all the factors that had to exist by chance for life to exist on any planet.
It's life, absolutely.
The number of factors that have been postulated has grown. Currently, the typical number you would see is, in a typical list, would have something like 20.
We find that we need to be at the right location in the galaxy, that we're inside the circumstellar habitable zone of a star, that we're in a planetary system with giant planets that can shield the inner planets from too many comet impacts, that we're orbiting the right kind of star that's not too cool or not too hot, that we're on a planet that has a moon that can stabilize the tilt of its axis, that we're on a planet that's a terrestrial planet, a planet that has a crust that's just thick enough that it can maintain plate tectonic activity, but it has enough heat in its interior that it's still circulating its liquid iron core so it can generate a magnetic field, that it has an atmosphere that has enough oxygen to allow for complex organisms to survive, that it has enough water and enough continents to allow for the diversity of life or an active biosphere that you need to support complex creatures such as ourselves. All these factors have to be met at one place and time in the galaxy. if you're going to have a planet as habitable as the Earth.
Isn't that amazing? Now, let me add to that. Now, you might say, well, even in that time, they've found more stars. This video was made in 2004. They found more stars. Is there a chance that, they've not only found more stars, in the video they said that they estimated the number of factors were 20. In the 11 years since then, they now say the number of factors is estimated around 200. And as they factor that out, even with the incredible number of stars that they have, they say conservatively the chance of life existing on a planet, it's not that you now have thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions. The chance is incredibly remote that life ever started on any one planet. There are far more factors that would say that life shouldn't exist even where we're at, let alone it started somewhere else. Now, what's that say? I mean, what that's saying is when you look at this, the whole argument is that life is easy and we should have been able to start and it's all by accident and nature seems to explain all these things. No, it's not easy. And everything that we see seems to point not towards chance and random selection and all these things, but it's design. But it's not only design, but it also is the idea that we're part of a plan, that we're created for a purpose, that Earth is special. It's not only that Earth is special, but that you are special. That it's not that you're just at a speck and what God concerned about you. No, that God created you and He knows you and He knows all the stars by name. He knows you by name. He knows how many hairs are on your head. And for some people that's pretty easy, but for other people it's pretty tough. He knows you and He loves you. And the Bible is a story about a God who is not a creator, but a God who is pursuing us in relationship. See, ultimately, we have to say, okay, what do we conclude? What do we conclude about this? And I'm going to tell you, when we look at all these issues we've seen again and again, there's no evidence for creation. The things that they would say that should be there aren't there. There's no answers. They're floundering for answers. There's incredible evidence against them. And it's not just that we're saying, well, believe in God because they don't have an answer. All of it points towards design. All of it points towards creator. All of it perfectly fits what we would expect when we read, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Now the question is, where do you go from there? You have the faith, because again, faith is consistent with reason, but it's something that goes beyond reason. Faith is trusting in what you have good reason to know is true. But it's not just knowing it's true. It's saying, God, I not only know that you are, that you're creator, but I trust you. It's knowing that He's pursued us and wants a relationship with us, and it's answering that call and committing to that relationship. It's agreeing that God pursued us because we were sinners and we were separated from Him, but He's pursued us through Jesus Christ, and He now makes a way for our sins to be forgiven. And this God who holds all the universe together, who knows the stars, who measures it like this, is calling you by name and says, I want relationship with you. How are you going to respond? And if you don't have that relationship with Him, I pray and hope that you will do so today, that today will be the day that you say, God, I not only agree that you exist, but I acknowledge that you want a relationship with me. Forgive me through Jesus Christ. Give me that relationship. If we've wandered away, recognize that God has you here today because He's drawing you in back to intimate relationship with you. Are you willing to respond? And for those who have that relationship, be confident of your great and loving God who knows you and is powerful enough to control all things and is concerned about the very details of our life. And that should give us great hope and confidence as we seek to live out our life in sometimes what can be a very uncertain world. Amen? Great truths.